Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Schultz, and I'm the president of Schultz & Williams, consulting firm nationally, but based in Philadelphia and Washington. This is the third webinar we've had that we're calling Leadership Matters, which we launched during the crisis. It's going to be called the crisis, not going to be called the pandemic, because it was COVID, it was systemic racism, the recession, and the economic impact, the dismantling of democracy. All of that happened during a year's time, and but we started these to get the leadership perspective on how nonprofits were coping with the crisis or the crises, and how they were looking forward to recovery in the future. So we've been totally blown away by the ability of nonprofits to manage their affairs productively during this truly unprecedented time. It's easy to see that 2020 exposed, however, while they were being productive and they were keeping their organizations going, the crisis has also exposed a lot of weaknesses that nonprofits had. And the old, in Chinese, crisis is spelled with two symbols. One's danger and the other's opportunity. The opportunity now is beginning to emerge. What we can do, not just to get back to normal or to our new normal, but to really look forward in terms of recovery, to do things better. And I think that all of those elements of the crisis that we're talking about are leading into that process. We learned during this time that Americans were incredibly generous in their response. As a firm that does a lot of fundraising consulting, and as somebody who's been in the fundraising world for over 40 years, I was amazed. I was just blown away. And if you saw the Giving USA report, 2020 is going to be recorded now as the highest year of charitable giving on record, which is amazing. Now, some of that came from large transformational gifts, but there was just also money coming in, grassroots, over the transom, to support organizations, both that people had been engaged with in the past, but also new money that poured into some of the frontline organizations that are out there, the food banks and the meals programs, and to healthcare and for frontline responders. Oh, sorry about that. That's not supposed to ring. I'm in the conference room. That never rings. So anyway, it's been amazing. And all of those donors now that came in over the transom have got to be converted to being not just transactional, but to have real worth as longtime donors. So that's one of the things we're seeing that's out there. A lot more cultivation, a lot more stewardship, but still asking. And the organizations that succeeded did not pull back in their asking, which was important. The impact on nonprofits and their response to the crisis varied greatly, depending on the sector that they were in, and in terms of their decision making that they made. We categorize some organizations as thriving, other organizations as challenging, people that could recover because they were doing some of the right things, and then just a whole sector of fragile that are still going to be it's going to be very difficult for them to get back on their feet and to be sustainable again. During our discussion about the crisis and the CEOs that we brought to the webinars with us, there was one common theme that really came out, which is that they reported that their primary concern has been staff wellness, that the layoffs, doing more with fewer people, and Vic DeWan from the Zoological Society of Philadelphia made a brilliant observation about the fault lines. People who had been on the front line and had to come to work every day, and the other ones who were laid off or furloughed, So bringing the staff back together is also been a big issue. The final thing we saw was that as CEOs, leaders like you all have to manage up and down. And that the board responses to the crisis were very, very different. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So my apologies. So they were very different. Some boards said, close it down, because they saw their role as being only financial, only not even fundraising, financial stewardship and responsible for the organization, only financially. Others made tough decisions about investing in new technology, building out their platforms for digital, communicating with people in more brilliant and innovative and aggressive ways. They kept going. But the process is always, when you talk about board response, it's about board composition, it's about board culture, it's about managing up and down by the CEO who's put in this very tough situation. So while we were thinking about all that, we read this brilliant article by Ann Wallestad from BoardSource, who's with us today, to talk about a new dimension in thinking through what board leadership is really going to be. You know, as fundraisers, we always talk about you have to have a prospect pool of people who have the ability and the willingness to give. You have to have a strong case for support that's easy to understand. You have to have organizational capacity to do fundraising, and you have to have board leadership. So I've always been raised on that, the TTT, the WWW, the GGG, which is all about fundraising, give, get, and get off, and wealth, wisdom, work, and talent, time, and treasure. That's what Ann has looked at. The reality of the boards have been built with that in mind. And is that really leading to the kind of success that nonprofit organizations really need moving forward? And I think that this time period we're in is providing an opportunity to think about these things differently and strategically and culturally, and it's time to make some changes. So that's my intro, but Ann Wallestad is the CEO and president of BoardSource, and she is going to talk about her article that appeared in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which I hope everyone's had a chance to read. I think we linked to it. If not, please do, and do what I did. Read it 3 times, because there's a lot of lines that you'll miss, and you have to read it again. It's brilliant. And Jan Brown. Jan is, will tell you who she is, but Jan is going to speak to us as a dual leader, a hybrid leader, because as the executive director of a wonderful organization that is committed to helping people in their road to recovery, but also as the chairman of another organization that's in the same space. And Jan has been doing this for a few years. I'm being nice, Jan. It's been a long time, and you have demonstrated the ability, the expertise, and the caring nature that organizations need to survive. And you've also been what Ann is going to talk about now, which is being a purpose-driven organization, not just a mission-driven organization. And Ann can describe that in terms of what that really means. By the way, if you have any questions, Takita Battle is going to capture your questions while we're speaking to you. She's there she is. And at the end, she'll come back on and she'll facilitate the question and answer part of our discussion. So hopefully the phone won't ring anymore in my conference room, but if it does, I'll make myself go to mute. But I want to introduce Ann and then Jan, and then we'll come back to talk to you again. So Ann, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Scott. And thanks to you and to Schultz and Williams for making today possible. You've been a great partner to BoardSource, and we're really pleased to be able to have this conversation today about a topic that we think is really important, which is board leadership and what needs to change in terms of board leadership. So special thanks to all of you for joining us. I see we've got 120 folks with us today. So obviously an important conversation to be having in this moment in time. As Scott mentioned, today's conversation, at least what I'm bringing to it, really does draw from an article that BoardSource published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review in March, which really argues that this is a moment that calls for true reinvention of the nonprofit board. And it offers or attempts to offer a new way of thinking about the board's most essential work, a framework that, as Scott mentioned, we are calling purpose-driven board leadership. I want to start by just acknowledging that purpose-driven board leadership is not a silver bullet solution to all board challenges, nor is it a new structure or model that needs to be learned and applied rigidly. It is, at least as we at BoardSource see it, a new way of being for boards, and one that we believe could really strengthen the way that social sector organizations are governed and led, and create some fundamental shifts in the way that we each see ourselves as leaders and organizations in terms of our work within the sector. It centers on the long-held BoardSource belief that boards must be strategic bodies. So this gets at what you were saying, Scott, in terms of, how folks are understanding their roles today. So we have always believed that boards must be strategic bodies, and that boards that deprioritize or undervalue their strategic role and instead focus solely or primarily on things like oversight or fundraising are doing so at the risk of organizational effectiveness and resilience. So for us, that's not new. But what it's doing as sort of as a way of thinking is building on that core belief and arguing that for boards to bring relevance, accountability, and integrity to that strategic role, they must have knowledge and insights about the work that the organization does and the community that it seeks to serve. And it acknowledges that unfortunately, that's just not the reality for many boards today. So some of you might be familiar with BoardSource's regular study that we do called Leading with Intent. It used to be called the Governance Index. We put it out every 3 years or so, looking at trends in board composition, board practices, board strengths, board areas of challenge. And our most recent study actually came out last week and just found some really troubling things in terms of where boards are today. So I want to share just a few highlights from that most recent study, which is also mentioned in the article. So first, boards are unfortunately quite disconnected from the communities and people that they serve. We found that 49% of all of the chief executives, and I use that term for chief executives, head of schools, executive directors, so all inclusive, half of chief executives said that they did not have the right board members to establish trust with the communities that they serve. Only a third said that they place a high priority on knowledge of the community served in board recruitment. And even fewer, 28%, place a high priority on membership within the community served. And I would note here that this was not a forced ranking. So everything that we asked about could have been listed as a high priority. So when it's not listed as a high priority, it's an intentional, sort of saying this is just not something that we are placing a top priority on in our board recruitment. The second finding that I want to share is that we saw that boards are ill-informed about the ecosystems in which their organization is operating. So only 25% of boards said that knowledge of the organization's work or field is a high priority in board recruitment, and only 11% were placing a high priority on prior or current experience with a similar organization or mission area. So you get a sense that when it comes to the expertise that is sought out in terms of board leadership, knowledge of the organization's work and the ecosystem in which it's operating is just not a priority. We also found that boards are lacking in racial and ethnic diversity. This is unfortunately not new, and it is very consistent with past studies. But just to kind of put a fine point on that, boards are overwhelmingly white. So 78% of board members are white. And perhaps even more troubling, we think so, 19% of boards are all white, meaning not a single member of color serving on the board. And there's a lot more that Leading with Intent kind of drills down on that. We actually did 2 reports this year, one that is a close look at the diversity, inclusion, and equity findings. But what I'll share for purposes of today's conversation is we asked CEOs and board chairs who were surveyed, what's the impact of the current racial and ethnic diversity or lack thereof? And they themselves were pointing to real challenges in terms of what it means to have a board that is lacking in diversity. So challenges in terms of their ability to understand their organization's operating environment and work, challenges in terms of attracting and retaining talent for both the board and the staff, challenges in terms of really bolstering the organization's reputation and standing in the public, including with funders and donors. So there is real impact that this lack of diversity is having, as reported by nonprofit leaders themselves. So it's not diversity for diversity's sake in the way that leaders are sharing the impact of their current board composition. And then finally, and I think this is, especially important given the context that you shared, Scott, boards are unfortunately preoccupied with fundraising in some ways above all else. So when asked how important the board's performance is across 18 areas of board responsibility, and I'll say this was not a forced ranking, 70% of chief executives said that fundraising was very important. That was higher than any other area of board performance in terms of ranking of, very important. And it was above things like thinking strategically as a board, setting the strategic direction of the organization, knowledge of organizational programs, and understanding of the context in which the organization is working. So I share all of this, not just to say there's some troubling trends here, but also to share it as context for the thinking that we've been doing now for years at BoardSource about why is this, how can this be, and what would it take to change? So, we've been asking ourselves, looking at past studies, what's going on underneath these kind of data points? How can this be? How can boards really tolerate or withstand this tremendous disconnection from the work of their institutions and the people and the communities that they seek to serve? And that's really where our direct engagement and conversations with boards and executives has been so illuminating. And our work, particularly our leadership work, which has been pushing boards to think differently about their leadership on things like public policy and advocacy, on strategic partnerships, on diversity, inclusion, and equity, we were hearing really consistently that too many boards are simply not centered on the board as a strategic body. And because of that, they aren't really considering how their board's composition could negatively impact its capacity for strategy. They're failing to see the connection between who the board is and what that means in terms of the perspective that they are or are not bringing into the boardroom and why that matters so much. So we saw that this we have seen consistently how much this really is about the fundraising role and the perception that the board's fundraising role is what is most important and more important than all other things, including strategy. And the data makes a lot more sense in that context because the dissonance is easier to understand when you're thinking about boards that really aren't prioritizing strategy or thinking about the strategic role that the board needs to play and the big strategic decisions that boards have to make, everything from selection of the CEO to setting organizational strategy to allocation of organizational resources. Those weren't the things that boards were often built to do. They were built to fundraise. And so it's not necessarily surprising that they're challenged in terms of understanding why current board composition is such a risk. So we really at BoardSource began to think about what needs to shift to drive a different way of being for boards. And what emerged for us was an understanding that we really needed to do two things. One, we needed to shift the way that boards understand their most essential work in a way that centers strategy and direction setting. And two, we needed to articulate the mindset shifts needed to position boards to be able to do that well and with integrity. And that's really, the background, the context for this thinking around the 4 principles of purpose-driven board leadership. They are, this article is the thinking that continues to grow from it, is an articulation of what we at BoardSource believe are the mindset shifts that are necessary. And as I said at the top, this is really a philosophical versus a structural shift. So I want to just walk through at a high level of summary, what are the 4 principles? I'll share a little bit more context, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jan because we're going to, sort of move into what does this really look like in practice, and then open it up for some conversation with Scott. So the 4 principles are, first, principle 1, purpose before organization. And what that means is having a board that is oriented to its work as a board and the organization that it is stewarding, that prioritizes the organization's purpose versus the organization itself. And that might sound like semantics, but it's actually really, really significant. We talk in the article about, in some ways, this is a deconstruction of the way that we classically have understood the duty of loyalty, where the duty of loyalty is to the organization and to only think about the organization. We're saying, no, it's deeper than the organization. It's about the reason that the organization exists. And the loyalty of the board needs to be to that reason for existence, that purpose. And that decisions that are rooted in purpose, it's not that they disregard the organization, but they think about the organization as a steward for the purpose rather than the organization as an ends in and of itself. The second principle is respect for ecosystem. So you heard me talking about, lack of knowledge or insight about the ecosystem in which an organization operates. And when I say ecosystem, I mean all of the systems in which an organization functions. So that's, of course, the cast of other organizational players that are interacting with the organization and the people and community that the organization serves. But it's also the funding environment. It's the public policy environment. It's the place in which the organization operates and the dynamics of that geographic location and community. It's the environmental ecosystem. All of the things that impact the way that the organization works, or that the way that the organization works could impact. So it's both what happens to an organization within ecosystem and what an organization does that impacts the ecosystem in which it's operating. So what we're saying in purpose-driven board leadership is simply acknowledging that an organization's actions can positively or negatively impact its surrounding ecosystem, and challenging boards to make a commitment to being a respectful and responsible ecosystem player and caring about the health of the ecosystem rather than just the organization itself. And you see how these are mutually interdependent principles that build on each other. The third principle is an equity mindset. So a commitment to advancing equitable outcomes and interrogating and avoiding the way in which the organization's strategy and work may reinforce systemic inequities. So acknowledging that, if you don't understand what the programmatic outcomes are for your organization in a way that understands, disparities that might exist based on different parts of your community, and being willing to really interrogate those disparities if they do exist and find ways to undo them. That's what we're talking about in terms of equity mindset. And fourth and finally, authorized voice and power. So the recognition that organizational power and voice must be authorized by those impacted by the organization's work. And I would say, that at the board level is understanding that if you are not connected to the community, and if your decisions as a board and your leadership as a board is not trusted by the community that you serve through that connection, the whole organization is at risk. Everything that it does can be questioned and should be, in terms of the work that you're trying to do. So I said before, we're going to have time for conversation about these principles and what they really mean, but I want to offer just a few more thoughts as context for that conversation, and then I'll hand it over to Jan. While we are at BoardSource calling for big, significant change to the way that boards are oriented, as we said at the top, the shift can really be incremental and evolutionary versus revolutionary. It doesn't require that a whole new board be built or that a whole new structure or model of governance be applied. It's about, sort of daily choices and shifts in the way that the organization and the board is operating. It's about where the board is centered in terms of its energy and focus, and the need to think about loyalty to purpose versus to the organization itself. And it can start with asking really different questions. So just one example, a traditional board might ask, where do we want to be in 5 years? Whereas a purpose-driven board might ask, where do we want our community or cause to be in 5 years? And what will it take from ourselves and others to get there? So let me pause there. I'm really looking forward to our conversation together. And I'll hand it off to Jan to share her reflections.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you again, Scott, for having me. I'm really excited, especially when I got the opportunity to read Anne's article, because it's something that evolutionary-wise, that we've grown into. I was commenting earlier that when I started this work and where this work is now are so different. And so just by way of introduction, my name is Jan Brown. I am the Executive Director of SpiritWorks Foundation, which is a recovery community organization with recovery centers in Williamsburg, Virginia, and Northern Virginia, and Warrenton, Virginia. And I am the immediate past chairperson of Faces and Voices of Recovery, which is a national advocacy organization in which we represent individuals and families and communities who are on the journey, if you will, from addiction to long-term recovery. And so the story that I shared earlier was many, many years ago, as Scott mentioned, when I came to this work, my board membership started off as tokenism. And so what that looked like was that I was able to check off many boxes. And so I'm a woman, and there's a box, and I'm Black, and there was a box, and I identify as LGBTQ, and there was a box. And so, my goodness, my participation or membership, if you will, on the board meant they got 3 for the price of 1. And depending upon the organization, they might get more. And so very much what it was about is my value, if you will, was that I could check those boxes. And then fast forward or move through, 15, 20 years, and being able to start an organization and receive support from folks like Scott and from Anne's organization really put us on a path to where we think differently. We didn't know that there was a name for it, but certainly it's that piece of intention has been so very important. So being the executive director of SpiritWorks, but then being a member of the board of Faces and Voices, and then becoming board chair, and how those 2 roles didn't always, that there can be tension within having those roles. And so being able to kind of look at it from both sides of the head of a coin. And so some of the piece that was mentioned, when I read the article, I was so excited because it really outlined what it is that we do. First and foremost with both organizations, what's most important is the purpose, right? Ultimately, being able to help individuals and families achieve and then sustain long-term recovery. Again, doesn't mean that it's always been, there will be people who approach us and say, I want to be part of Faces and Voices, or I want to be part of SpiritWorks. And then the next question is, what is your relationship with recovery? Are you an individual? Are you a family member? Are you a community member? What is it that you're going to bring to this? In addition to some of the more technical skills that one might bring. And so that is first and foremost what we look for when inviting people to board membership is what is this about for you? Is it, for some folks, they're at the end of their career and it's important for them to be able to participate on boards. But for us to be able to get what we need to get done, being on purpose is all we really have. I was listening to Scott when he was talking about some of the fundraising and how that's been a challenge for us because of the stigma and misunderstanding, et cetera, around the topic of addiction and recovery. And so, that while it has needed to be very important, having very passionate people around the topic, people who have lived experience, if you will, of the topic. And one of the things that you mentioned, Anne, is something that, we get to lead at the speed of trust, because the people that we are serving know that, that we are the people we serve is one of the things that we talk about. And so being able to emerge from the community and to serve within the community, it makes us far more effective leaders because we have the opportunity to do so. And sometimes that means making really difficult decisions. Mentioning place, for example, it would be nice to have an office in particular areas, but if we're really going to dig deep into these communities and be representative of them, that means that we need to put our offices there. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're headquartered there, but it does mean that we need to be a face so that people can see who we are and know who we are. And that piece of trust becomes so very important. Around diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, that knowing that, so for us, it's been kind of a dual role, having our board composition actually reflect that, as well as making sure that those that we are serving reflects that. In the addiction and recovery world, people often talk about the fact that addiction doesn't discriminate. And it's a clever, wonderful saying. Access and affordability and some of those other things make it more difficult. But our customers and our place and our funders and all of those different, people that we have a responsibility to makes it very important in terms of how we're prioritizing, if you will, how we go about doing business. And so, again, having when I got to meet with Scott in preparation and he shared with me the article, to really know that there's a name for what it is that we're doing has been so significant, because it lets us know that, we're not upside down because we don't look like so many other boards that we're aware of and that some of us may or may not have served on. And so being able to move some of these things even further forward, one of the things that Scott had talked to me about as well is what are some of the weaknesses and challenges of doing this real time, if you will. And one of those is that, we try not to over represent with individuals served or people with lived experience, because those technical skills are also important. That fundraising is important. Having somebody who understands the legal system and can really function in terms of writing bylaws and things like that are extremely important. But not when you were talking, and I thought, wow, there's really organizations that only prioritize fundraising. Is kind of shocking to me, because yes, it's important, but if you're not on purpose, then what is, it's like, what are you raising all the money for? Would be the question that my board would ask. It's a strange thing that we don't ask for money unless we know what we're going to do with it. And I've been told that that's unusual as a way to be. But again, it goes back to allowing us to really remain true to our purpose. If we're not, every time a funding opportunity comes through, we don't jump on that, because we need to make sure that that's what we have talked about in terms of our strategic plan and who it is that we say that we are serving. And so it's so important to know what our values are, and certainly to know what our mission and vision are. But all of those lead to purpose, instead of serving for the sake of mission, or serving for the sake of vision, or serving for the sake of values, for that matter. And I think that one of the things that we used to talk about, not having the word purpose, was this notion of servant leadership, and kind of growing out of that. But that doesn't go far enough. I mean, the way that you all are looking at it, I think, is the best of the traditional model, blending that with servant leadership. Because just serving doesn't get you there either. And so I've been really excited to learn more about the work that you all are doing. And like I said, having a name for what it is that we do beyond simple servant leadership has just been amazing. And so I'm really grateful to be able to participate, and certainly questions will arise from our conversation more fully.
Well, I'll tell you, both of you, thank you obviously so much for just, setting this up, and to have both and I don't mean to say yours is theoretical, but it's thought through that way. And what Reverend Jan Brown has done in her own organization organically, and yes, and defined what you do, Jan. And I think that that's one of the things that's going to be hopeful about the way we look at board leadership in the future. I have a couple of comments. Ann, I was interested when you were talking about your study and how it listed fundraising as being one of the most important things. Because I got to tell you, a lot of fundraisers out there would tell you carefully and quietly, probably, that their boards don't do enough fundraising. And so, they may say that, but in terms of actually doing it, a lot of boards that I've worked with, and we've worked with hundreds and hundreds of organizations, they always have a few people on their board who really do the fundraising, and the rest of them kind of say they're fundraisers. And that's nothing wrong with that, except that's not their skill set. They're not trained to do it. And maybe they don't have the peer relationships that some of the other people have. So I think that it's going to require some cultural, change in demonstrating that there's added value to your fundraising case for support by being a purpose-driven organization. Making that part of the conversation that says, this is why you should give to us, and still using your fundraising responsibility and being able to actually manage it a little bit better, because not everybody on the board should be expected to do some of those things, frankly. We have a lot of foundations that say they want another checkoff, Jan. They want check off the box that says a 100% participation by the board, or what's the percentage of giving to your capital campaign that came from the board. We've got to talk about the percentage of purpose that came from the board, and start to talk about that very, very differently. So I think that's just one of my many thoughts on this incredible subject. And let me ask you a couple of questions on behalf of everybody, and then we'll get to Kita's questions later. But most of your study, although not the case you used, was about the social sector. And does this change at all if we're looking at environment or arts and culture, anything else? How do you still apply the same things to you know, a symphony orchestra or an art museum that you do for a recovery program or a homeless organization to end homelessness. There's an organization here in Philadelphia where I live that I was always impressed with. They had big celebrities on their board, and a couple of the most impressive and wonderful philanthropists in town were sitting across from them, a seat at the table. There were people who'd lived homelessness. So they really understood the root causes of it. So it's not sweeping people off the street. You know, it's providing for addiction services and mental health and jobs and domestic violence and all of those things. Having a board member that's trying to raise money for a new building who doesn't have anybody there with the perspective of what it is like being on the street is too big of a leap to imagine that somebody well-intentioned who's there for fundraising could possibly understand the emotional connection to that case for support. So I'm just curious, Ann, how will this move across sectors?
Yeah, so I'll start by just sharing that from a definitional perspective, when I say social sector, I do mean the broad nonprofit sector. So the thinking behind the article and the work that we do at BoardSource is designed to be, and we hope is, relevant across all of the diversity of the nonprofit sector. So it was not written with the assumption of just a smaller set. That said, I think what you're pointing to is real, which is what it actually looks like within different subsectors of the nonprofit sector is not, it's not universal. And that's part of why I'm so careful to say this is not a model that should be applied rigidly. It is more of a philosophical orientation to the board's role and the board's work, and what we think is most important in terms of the way that board members operate as individuals and as a collective in service to their organization and its purpose. So I think the things that you're raising in terms of what a board needs to be built to do, and what, you know, can sometimes happen when it's built to do one thing but then asked to do another, is, you know, spot on in terms of what we're seeing. And, you know, as Jan was saying, you know, composition flows from what you think is most important, and what you think the board's job is and what the board needs to be able to do. And I think, you know, that boards are often populated with an emphasis on technical skills, so legal, financial, real estate, human resources, marketing, and then sort of filtered through the litmus test of to what extent can they raise funds for us. And if you think about what that does in terms of the board's composition and what it's set up to do and what it's not set up to do, the data that I'm sharing is not at all surprising, because that's how we've built boards, to do a job that's focused on oversight, and to do it in a way that says nobody can do that oversight role unless they can also fundraise. And I'm being, you know, I'm painting with a broad brush, but as you heard in the data and from the Leading with Intent study, it's a broad brush that is broadly true. So trying to unpack what would it take to change, what would that do, how could we recreate or re-envision a social sector that is connected where it is currently disconnected. That's really what purpose-driven board leadership is all about.
But let me ask you one more follow-up question,
Sure.
Ann, and then I've got a couple for Jan. The reality, as you say, this is going to evolve. It's not going to be a drastic change. You come in and implement. But the reality is that a lot of nonprofit boards are dominated by one or two people. Sometimes they're the big fundraiser, sometimes they're the major donor, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they just have a knack for board leadership, and they end up sort of intimidating others, if you will. And all I mean saying this, prefacing this, is that implementing your model is going to be confronted with the realities of a person that says, no, 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 that's not what we're here for. And in your article, you address that you can go out during a strategic planning process, you can go outside externally and interview people and get the perspective of some of your constituencies. That's not the same thing as having them on your board with a seat at the table. So I'm curious what your advice would be to an executive director or a president, CEO out there who might be thinking, this is great, this is what I have to do, but I've got to convince so-and-so that this is the right thing to do. What's the next step?
Yeah, and it's a big question, and I don't know that there's an easy answer, because there would be so many questions that I would want to ask of that, chief executive or president in terms of what's going on, and what the history and culture of the board is, and who is this person, and how are they showing up, and what's their history. So I'll try and offer some thoughts, but I just want to caveat that it depends. All that said, I think that it really does start by having different conversations and asking different questions. And I know that sounds very simple, but so much of what boards do is asking good questions. And so it is possible for another board member, who isn't necessarily the power broker or the center of gravity for the board's power, to start to help the board to shift by asking different questions, by even saying, whose perspective would be important for us to have before we make this decision? What are we not hearing based on who's sitting around this table right now? The president can ask those questions, or the CEO, but they also can have conversations with other board members about, I'm trying to build some muscle here, and what do you think about this, and how do you think we could bring this into the boardroom? And enlisting folks, who might be similarly inclined to ask different questions to speak up a little bit. And I think that a board can, just like we talk about, the board building its strategic muscle or its ability to think generatively, it takes practice. And so, being willing to start small, ask different questions, listen to different voices, consider different facilitative techniques that maybe break up the way that the board is used to deliberating and making decisions. All of those things can be helpful in doing some culture shifting and ground softening to support that culture shift.
Reverend Jan Brown, what's your take on what Ann just shared with us?
I think Ann is exactly correct. Having had different opportunities to get it both wrong and right. As I was thinking of a couple of examples or stories, and one in my role as an executive director, of thinking I was so wise to locate one of our centers on a bus route, because if the clients needed to be able to get there, and we embedded it in the community, we're patting ourselves on the back. And what we discovered was that it was on a really busy street, and some of the people would then have to walk down this very dangerous street. So while we had, sat around and thought of what we thought were all of the considerations that needed to be taken, we didn't realize that a mom pushing her buggy with her daughter in it would be very dangerous. And so simply by being able to ask the question, or to convene people who didn't have a driver's license or something along those lines, and I could tell many of such stories, but I think some of what has been so important about the ability to learn those things is that we've done so in conversation or collaboration. And I think because we are so on purpose, that it allows the people, when we do get it wrong, to know that we're in there with them, that we're going to continue to lead and to care. We're not going to force our way, when what we say is we're here for you, that this is why we're doing what we're doing. And so we really do need their input. But again, I think some of the challenges, I don't know whether they're necessarily weaknesses, but one that comes to mind particularly is getting into a very heated conversation, but thankfully it brought us all together to hear one another's perspectives. And what that looked like is a very traditional board and organization that serves young people. So their purpose is around helping children reduce their use of substances and preventing substance misuse and substance use disorder. And they were having a fundraiser where they were doing a wine pull, and that they were having and serving alcoholic beverages. So, immediately, my board and the organization are up in arms, because how dare you serve alcohol when you're an organization that's trying to prevent substance misuse? And it got rather charged. And the year that, the conversation was held, the organization went ahead and held the activity in the way that they did hear, the folks from our organization. And, things like, we raise so much more money when people have a few drinks, which may very well be the case, but at what cost, right? Exactly. And so it's not easy, and there was no easy answer to some of those kinds of things, because then we can sit around, doing our fundraiser, and we don't bring in the kinds of money, so there is some tension, and it always has to come back to purpose. Are we not going to get to serve people because we don't have the capacity or the money to do that? But what are we saying to the people we're serving if all we care about is the money?
That's amazing. Organizations are always fighting the impulse to survive, self-preservation, and some board members and some CEOs, they think that's their first, most important priority. But with Ann's discussion about ecosystem, I think it's easier to understand that you're never alone, that purpose, you share purpose with others, people, organizations, communities, and that your story is an excellent example of that. It probably, though, also brought your board closer together.
Absolutely.
Under your leadership, to make that kind of a statement. And I'm sorry, I cut you off there.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say, Jan, I love that story, because I think it illustrates that it doesn't necessarily mean that there is a right way of doing things or easy solutions and answers. But what I'm hearing in your story is, because of the way that your board has operated historically, even when there was disagreement, it didn't threaten trust or rupture in the same way that it could have. And I think that's a really key piece here is, you think about the most controversial or hardest decisions that a board has to make, around something hard. And to what extent will the people in the community that you serve feel like that was made by a group of people who I trust? That was made by a group of people who understood the decision they were making. That was made by a group of people who I can see, are sort of centered in a way that feels purpose-driven for this organization. And the alternative is risky.
Absolutely.
Really risky. Sorry, Jan, were you going to say more there?
No, I'm agreeing with you. It is very, very risky. I mean, to lose the trust of those that we serve would be completely damaging to the organization. And again, when in reading the article, that and recognizing that it takes time. and that it is a culture change. It doesn't mean that, in terms of the structure, we have fewer people or a greater number of people. It really is about making sure that it's being done in consideration of all of our customers or consumers, if you will. The other piece that I wanted to touch on is around that equity mindset that you mentioned, and the difficulty that we've had, and particularly it comes from a place of people who have been marginalized, however one would define that, for all of their lives, or perceived all of their lives. They have a sense of urgency that sometimes doesn't match the ability of the board or the organization to make some of these shifts. And so, once again, that's been something that's been very difficult. And it's required a tremendous amount of communication on our end, just making sure that the people know that we hear them, and that, we're moving as fast as we can, and that there are reasons for taking the time that we're taking, that, it's not going to be, we're going to bring 7 people on the board who come from, a marginalized community because, that's the right thing to do instantly. We'll get there. I mean, and so that too has to do with that piece of being on purpose, of knowing that if you have a 14-member board and you bring in 8 new people, that's going to change the culture completely. And so being really wise about how to move that forward, particularly because a lot of these folks are having pain points, and they're really finding ways and finding places for their voices to be heard. And so that is one of the challenges, if you will, that we face currently, especially given, some of the systemic issues that Scott mentioned early on in our conversation.
I think that the intentional listening that you're talking about, Ann, and that you're doing, Jan, every organization should go through that. And, some of them will go through it every 5 years when they're updating their strategic plan. But having a regular opportunity, I love this idea of operating within this ecosystem. I mean, we've worked with organizations that frankly have even come to us and said, we don't know if we should exist anymore. Somebody else is doing this, and they're doing it better, or they're doing it more financially. Maybe they have a board that does do fundraising, and maybe there's other reasons, but they're sharing this space. And, so and I think that this is going to happen more following the pandemic crisis, when we finally all can come out again and celebrate the fresh air. I think it's going to happen quite a bit. I think people are going to be looking at themselves differently. How did they survive? Was there financial success or lack thereof? Why did we have it or didn't have it? What are the reasons for it? Is it sustainable if we got through this? Maybe they got a loan. Maybe they got a big mega donor stepped up to the plate and did something for them. Are we sustainable as an organization? And if not, our purpose isn't going to go away. So who's going to do this? And I think that you're going to see more partnerships and collaborations. And again, to be able to do that successfully, we've got to educate the donor base. They have to know that we're working together. I love it when foundations, and some wonderful foundations, will say, why don't you guys work together? And I've actually answered a couple of people that I know well in that space saying, why don't you guys get together? Why don't 3 of you come together and approach this problem? And you know what? That's what they did around COVID. The COVID recovery funds in communities was the Community Foundation and other funding sources working together, pooling their resources, putting the money together, and getting it out to people as fast as possible. If we can do that during a crisis, we can have more sharing around purpose. And I think that you're going to start a conversation with this article, Ann, it's probably going to go beyond boards. It's probably going to go into organizational leadership, period. And Jan, that would be, again, you on both sides as an ED and as a board member, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And as you were talking, I think it will even extend further to how we do church leadership as well. I mean, there comes a time when we have to ask ourselves, is this program serving our purpose? And sometimes it's not, and it might be my favorite program as the ED. I can recall when we offered yoga, and it was convenient because I just had to go upstairs. But the community didn't see value in offering yoga. And so, over time, it meant that we needed to do something different with that space. And then with our resources, it was a far better place for children after school to come and do their homework than it was to serve, essentially the staff in going upstairs and doing it, especially when we had a YMCA down the street where we could go do yoga. So those are some of the changes and some of the things that we've had to go through in order to get there. And I think just the willingness for people to stay at the table and have those very difficult conversations is what I think one of the best things that comes out of doing some of this work is to really have that staying power and disagree, and sometimes disagree vehemently, but to be able to hear from one another what this work is about and what it really means to do it.
I love that example, Jan. It so beautifully, at least as I hear it, captures the idea of purpose before organization and also ecosystem, because it's, what are we here to do? What's most important for us to do? And also, how do we understand our organization's role in the context of other things that are happening in our ecosystem? And, to be able to bring those kinds of questions into board deliberation about what are we going to do, what are we going to not do, is so powerful and so valuable, and happening organically in lots of boards, but also could happen so much more. And Scott, I agree with you. We're not seeing it yet in terms of partnerships and mergers, and it has been kind of predicted, but I think it's too early to say, that it's not going to happen, because I think you're right that there's a lot of board level, staff level, sense making happening right now, based on what we've just been through. And, I'm hopeful that as boards bring a purpose-driven lens to those conversations, it will focus on possibility and what's best for purpose instead of only organizational survival. And I don't mean to be dismissive, because organizational survival is important in many ways, particularly when you're talking about a team whose livelihood depends on it. But it's not the only thing that is important. And I think that we can get stuck there in conversations when we aren't willing to open up and put a purpose frame around it. I'll just mention, I mentioned this before, that BoardSource has had some focused energy around strategic alliances and partnership. And so for those organizations that might be asking themselves some of those questions, we have a whole bunch of free resources available at a website called thepowerofpossibility.org. So we can drop that into the chat as a link, but some really helpful discussion guides and thought-provoking questions for boards to be asking themselves if they're thinking about partnership as a strategic proactive move, or if they are in a situation where they're asking, should we be thinking about closing our doors, and how to do that in a way that allows purpose to continue and to survive.
Well, I thought your article, we do a lot of strategic planning as well as fundraising, and we always start with mission, vision, values, the way your chart indicated, but you've added purpose to that. And it changes the conversation. It changes the way you look at this. Because when you have to look at the community that you're serving, not just your piece in it, I think that it brings a lot of new measures of success that you have to consider as you evaluate your program. It's not just about, you know, your financials or your metrics and how many people you serve. It's about the community, and it's about a larger group of people. And are we getting the job done? So I think that that's brilliant. I know we'll bring that forward in our strategic planning now. I mean, mission defines, you know, we talk about mission drift, you know, drifting off and starting kind of new things. I like this purpose. It's kind of hard to drift from purpose. You know, once you've defined it, it's pretty hard to drift away from it. And I think that adding that to the linear sort of discussion about mission, vision, values is just a very intelligent thing to do. And we're going to take a look at that, because we always look, you know, SWOT analysis does, strengths, weaknesses, threats, and opportunities. It always looks at the external as well as the internal. But I don't think that we focused enough on the external. Is there anything else we could be doing? I always have a question we ask, which is there anything we're doing now that we shouldn't be doing? And is there anything that we're not doing that we should be? It's just two basic questions. But, you know, Jan, that was your yoga question. You know, you had to ask yourself that question, and you had to drop something you really wanted to do, and you added something that you weren't doing.
Absolutely. Yes. And it came from that place of purpose and really holding that up. And even when we did our strategic planning at Faces and Voices, I mean, really holding up the reason that this organization exists is to do this. And so it becomes easy, because then you can sit in are we doing this? Yes or no? And if we're not, why not? And how do we, and then being able to even say, is this still what our purpose is? Because if it is, then we need to reflect that.
And understanding reality too, your mission may not be to do everything. So, you know, purpose first, or purpose foremost. Mission is still defining the business you're in. It defines your organization, but it's your organization within that sort of larger consideration. So, well, I would like to go to Takeda, and I know that it's lunchtime and probably some of you are leaving us, but I don't want you to leave without having your questions answered. So Takeda, thank you for joining us, and she's been monitoring the questions, and I'd like you to just go ahead and facilitate that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Very rich and engaging conversation, Scott, Ann, and Jan. Happy to be with everybody. Again, I'm Takeda Battle with BoardSource as the Director of Corporate and Federated Partnerships. So we have some meaty questions, really excited to dig in. So we're first going to start with our first one that came through our Q&A. How do you determine the right mix of directors with lived experience versus those with kind of technical skills, legal or financial?
So I'll take a stab at that, and it's going to sound like a cop-out answer, because I don't think that there's anything that I could say that would be right or universal for all. I think that really it starts with a conversation about what do we need our board to be able to do, and what perspectives do we need to be able to do that with authenticity, relevance, respect, and then kind of mapping what does that mean in terms of the networks to which we need to be connected or have access, the perspectives that we need to have for the conversations or deliberation or decision making that we do, the technical expertise that we might need to be able to run committees or, you know, do our oversight role. All of the things that kind of are important in terms of the board's makeup, and then thinking through, well, what does that actually mean based on the things that we've said about our board size, our committee structure, et cetera. So I know it's more than zero. I know it doesn't have to be 100% for it to be valuable. You know, I think you absolutely do need board members who can bring the technical expertise in key areas of legal and financial oversight. So I'm not dismissive of that. You do need board members who can be fundraising machines for your organization. So I think that from my perspective, the beauty of a board is it's not a binary choice. You don't have to say, if we need this, then we can't have this. You actually can have it all. And so thinking through what having it all would mean for your organization, I think is the place to start. Jan, what would you add there?
Sure. So the board's Faces and Voices board, as well as the board for SpiritWorks, we use a 51-49%. And so far that has served us well. So 51% of the board has to be people who have some type of lived experience, family members, and identified lived experience. It has been very helpful as well, because they are the people who are able to tell their stories, which really advances the purpose even further. It's always wonderful when we get, a person in long-term recovery who is also a fundraiser. I mean, you can't go wrong with that one. However, being able to I think for us, having that simple majority, 51-49, allows us to maintain that purpose.
But how did you arrive at that metric?
It was a battle because one of the boards went from 100%, as Ann mentioned, 100% being people with lived experience of addiction and recovery. And just because you are in recovery doesn't mean that you come with the technical skills that were necessary. I think how we eventually settled on that is really just having the majority, and having that majority voice will always return us to purpose.
It's interesting though that I've seen boards where, don't forget the culture of being on a board. I'm on boards. I mean, that there is a peer-to-peer expectation as well. I saw a bank president walk into his first board meeting at an organization one day, and as soon as the meeting was over, I told the president he's not coming back. It was his first meeting. I could just see him looking around the room and not recognizing people. So there has to be some education first about what kind of a board we are, what we're looking to do, and how they can be part of that. So that peer-to-peer part of it is very important. And I think that if you have a highly effective board right now, in terms of fundraising expertise and marketing, communication, law, whatever, you can always supplement the board without supplanting those people. And you can use your base and build on it, because all you're going to do is add value.
Absolutely.
So there might be some easier practical ways to do this than to say that we're going to transition, we're going to grow.
Right. Well,
Go ahead, Jan.
Well, I was going to say the other piece of it is that there are lots of committee structures that we have that go beyond board membership. And so people can gain some culture of the organization to see if it's a fit for them. Some of the formality and things like that for some of us, because I had grown up being on different boards, and to join some of the more recovery oriented boards. I mean, we didn't have Robert's Rules of Order. I mean, it was loose. It's like, what are we doing here? So I get that. I mean, there was no level of professionalization on some of these other ones. And so education, orientation, inviting people to participate on committees has been a nice way to really court and let the board member or potential board member off the hook before they say yes to something that just is not a fit for them.
Right.
And did you want to say something?
No, I'm good. I want to make sure we get to others. Good,
no problem. Our next question up is from a foundation. Question is, we're a foundation with a traditional fundraising board that does not reflect the community served by our grant making. Since our main mission involves fundraising to make grants possible, how do we get other folks into our board leadership without the pressure of large board dues while maintaining our peer-to-peer fundraising efforts via our board?
I'm not going to answer the question, but it's exactly the challenge that I think we're going to be facing with this, of rolling this out. And I think it's going to take education and culture and leadership. I think that for the chair of a community foundation, for instance, to stand up to say, hey, you guys all look alike. We did this. Has got to change, and to be able to have the confidence of saying that. Leadership first, and I think that substance will follow.
Yeah, and I would just add, and I'm not arguing the questioner's position. I don't know enough to be able to do that, but I have heard from others, who've asked the question, we only exist to fundraise. That is the purpose of our organization. What does this look like for us? For some, that might be true, that there are no strategic decisions that are being made by this board. There are no hiring decisions that are being made by this board. It exists, sort of as an auxiliary fundraising body with one beneficiary of its generosity. I know that there are organizations that are structured that way. And I do think it's fair to say, I'm not sure what this looks like for us. How do we make sure that, we're making good, responsible decisions in the way that we're fundraising? How do we make sure we're not applying pressure to this beneficiary organization that are informed by what we think is important? So I still think there's some relevance, but it might not feel as tightly connected for that type of organization as another one. But there are also a lot of organizations that exist solely to fundraise that are also making strategic decisions. They're choosing where the money goes. They're choosing who's going to lead from a staffing perspective. And so I would push back on the idea that that type of organization only exists to fundraise, because they are a strategic body. And if you are a strategic body, your strategy needs to be well informed.
And if I could add to that as well, having sat on boards where the primary purpose was to fundraise, and I didn't have the deep pockets to bring. What I did have was energy, passion around the purpose. And so where some could write the check, it might mean that I am participating in the event that's being held, and I'm telling the story of the purpose of that event. So there are really creative ways to be able to go about being able to do that. And yes, it is certainly a real issue.
Right. Talked a little bit about this fundraising piece, but are there any other metrics, examples of metrics to hold board members accountable other than those fundraising and giving goals? It's a little bit of an extension of the previous question.
Well, I think where DEI is certainly going to be an issue today moving forward. It's not going to be a checkoff box. We were talking about that, Jan, that you can just say you have a DEI statement. You're going to have to demonstrate that you have adopted a culture, or you've changed your culture, you're moving forward. There's going to be a lot of organizations that are going to be asked by corporate funders, foundations, for instance, what are you doing in this space? So being a progressive organization in that manner is going to be like having a solid financial statement. And I think that those are one of the things that they can do. So they're going to look at your workforce. They're going to look at your metrics in terms of, Takeda, you kind of tipped something off for me here, which is the idea that there's no such thing as just being a fundraising board. I mean, that's not why you exist. You exist to give the money to people who then are spending it on different purposes, right? And so you can borrow or connect to the metrics for the organizations you serve. If they're providing, classroom space and technology and serving people with addiction issues or the homeless or Meals on Wheels, those are your metrics too. And I think that that's building out your case for support as a foundation.
Yeah, I would just add, I think it's a great question. It is also a question that illuminates how much we see the board's role as a fundraising role, because accountability for board members is focused on accountability and fundraising. I would argue that the definition of board leadership and what a board exists to do has to be broadened, and then measures of accountability flow from that broadened view. So, there are things, and this is very basic, I don't mean to make it sound like this is the metric, but there are things like meeting attendance, meeting quality, engagement in the organization's work, engagement in public policy on behalf of the organization. There are so many different things that can be measured that are centered on, what is it that the board needs to be doing to be engaged and to lead this organization well, and that's what should be focused on in terms of accountability metrics for the
And
board.
BoardSource has published those for years in
Yep.
terms of those quantifiable, attendance, being an ambassador, a voice, doing those
Adoption of best practices.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Nancy, with us in the chat, and this is geared to you, spoke of the importance of board leadership having knowledge of community served. Is it ever helpful to have outsiders or those with this fresh perspective to be a part of the board? And can you speak a little bit to that issue?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So having outsiders, meaning people who don't understand the organization's work, is that
with a fresh
helpful?
Perspective. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that boards, they need diversity of perspective, and so they need folks who can see things from different angles, and think about things in a very robust, thoughtful, comprehensive way. I mean, that's why boards exist, is to have a group of people who see things differently, wrestling with something with the assumption that a group of people who don't all see things the same way will make a better decision. So you don't want to have a board that is populated in a way that is uniform in its thinking. But I think what I'm hearing underneath that question is it possible that if you're too close to the organization, that you can't have enough perspective on it? And I would push back there, because I think that proximity matters in a whole bunch of ways. And so the assumption that those who are more distanced from the work of the organization can make better decisions, I think we need to unpack that. So that's what I would offer.
I think that I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, there were two thoughts, because it's something that can happen. And when I was thinking about the question, where we got in trouble and became less effective was because we didn't know, as people in recovery, and we didn't know what we didn't know. And we became, we speak the same language, we understand what we're saying, but then when we would go to do advocacy work, well, gosh, we didn't even recognize that people didn't have, an understanding of what we were saying when we would say we're in recovery. So being able to have opportunities for folks like that has been helpful. But again, it's really, for us, it's been about that relationship building to have the outsiders, because what we want is outsiders to become insiders, and for us to really recognize that everybody doesn't know some of the nuances and some of the language and some of the culture that we're using. And so being able to expand that has been helpful. The other way that we've had to do that is being older and inviting younger people on the board who are growing up in a very different culture than what we've become accustomed to. And so in that regard, being able to recognize that while the topic and the purpose is the same, their lived experience is very different of the issue. And so seeing them somewhat, as an outsider, and they'll tell us, you all are a very closed board. And kind of, how dare you, when you're reflecting, what a board is supposed to look like.
I think there was actually a question that came in from Bonnie. What are your thoughts on having more board members that are younger? So you kind of touched on that already. The rest of it was, board members might not have the means or capacity yet to make substantial donations, but they may have a more open mindset and fresh perspective versus older board members who may potentially be set in their ways or used to doing things the same way. Any additional thoughts, Anne?
Yeah, I'm on a board that has I'm on a board that has incredible young energy, and we've been recruiting that energy. And there's other people on the board, like old people like me, that are there for other reasons. And but I tell you, that energy that they bring to the room their commitment, their passion. It stops you from getting old. It reminds you of the reason for being, and it gives you hope that and confidence that people are going to rotate off boards. So you got to have a succession plan, and part of that plan is to have young people day one who have that bring their youth and enthusiasm to the boards. And probably, by the way, I know a lot of mid-30 board members that have already been, in a law firm for 10 years. They may be chronologically young, but they are not young in their experience.
This one comes from Gail. Thinking across the principles you articulated, and much of the art world is rooted in dominance of Eurocentric art and audiences, so that the ecosystem, the audiences, the communities, and the institutions all need to be kind of reinvented to move beyond this white supremacy focus. How do you actually ground mission and purpose that shifts all of an organization's current reality?
Big question.
Big question.
Can't answer it quickly, but I would point actually to the story that I share within the article itself, which is the story of an organization, a museum based in San Diego, formerly known as the Museum of Man, recently renamed themselves as the Museum of Us. And I raise them because it's such a powerful story of organizational transformation, and really all of the shifts that an organization can go through. And it also is a great example of how one organization, at the unit level, is being informed by and informing their ecosystem. So the Museum of Us not only went through a ton of change centered on a decolonization effort for themselves, but they also are really sharing their learnings and their experiences with other museums who are contemplating similar change. So I hear you, and I hear how overwhelming it might be to think about all of the things that need to change within an institution. And I think, to the extent that we are all on a journey, we all relate to that. But thinking about, where can I start? Where can we start? What does that mean in terms of the conversations that we need to have as a board about how we start? And then taking those steps. And I think in some ways that speaks to Jan's point earlier too about, the urgency for change, and the tension between the urgency for change and the need to slow down enough to do that change well. Jan, you were going to add something?
Yeah, I was going to add, I have a colleague who works at a university, and the land that the university is on happened to be indigenous land. And so he has a quote on all of his emails at the very bottom that reminds all of us when we read his email where that land came from. And so that was a very simple way that he's chosen to be able to begin to raise that issue. So yeah.
We have time for what? Okay.
Takeda, no, I saw the chat come up about storytelling, and I just want to emphasize that
Sure.
Organizations that start board meetings with stories, instead of facts and figures and financial statements. And I know we have to follow Robert's rules and there's to approve the minutes, but I was at a Ronald McDonald House once when the meeting started, and they always bring somebody in, a family in. And I tell you, you just want to put your weight behind something. Watch a mother who's suffering from 14 straight weeks at a children's hospital, try to save her child's life, while her husband's back home in Texas and she's in Philadelphia. That's a story. And that's something that board members want to hear. And sometimes the leadership wants to move right into the business side because they think that's their part of the business. Don't do that to your board members. Engage them, involve them, tell them the stories, give them the background. So I saw that one come up and I wanted to answer that. So.
Well, I think we have only 1 minute left, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. There were some questions that we did not get to, but this has been just an amazing experience and time for everybody who was with us today. So thank you for all of the questions. Thank you, Jan and Scott, for answering in such an amazing way to address what our attendees wanted to get more information on. So I will hand it over to Schultz and Williams.
Well, I just want to thank you all. Takeda, thank you. Ann, Jan, you guys are great. I'm really glad that we landed on this topic, and your article was the inspiration for that. We're going to keep exploring leadership. Leadership matters. We know how hard it is, the burden that it's placed, and also the joy you get from actually completing something. And I think that, I'm sure that Jan, you see it in the faces and the voices of recovery, and our other clients see it in many, many different ways. But sharing these stories coming from CEOs and board members and leaders as a fundraiser for 40 plus years, I can tell you that I've never been mistaken about why we do this. We don't do it to raise money. We do it to solve problems. We do it to feed. My favorite client is my Meals on Wheels client in California. We feed 3,000 homebound seniors a hot meal every day. I mean, to me, it's never about the numbers. It's about that. So you've reminded me of that, Ann, by talking about purpose. And I'll never forget all of the different purposes, that we're privileged to be involved in. So thank you, both of you, and to Takeda and to Nicole, who put this together on my end. And to all of you out there, thank you for giving us your lunch hour. I hope we didn't give you indigestion, but we gave you some inspiration. So thanks very much. And we'll sign off now and watch for future Leadership Matters webinars. Thanks.